Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on durability and scaling. My name is Richard Cole. I am the Director of Strategic Learning and Practice for the Scaling Community of Practice. I think having looked at who's on the participants, most of you have attended a webinar before, but just in case you haven't, the Scaling Community of Practice has been in existence for about 10 years. It's a member-owned and run organization. We primarily serve as a forum for people who work in international development to exchange views and experiences about how to scale up innovations, programs, and affect a large-scale impact in the world. We have a large number also of particular working groups on specific areas and sectors such as agriculture, health, education, fragile states that regularly organize webinars like this. We also do studies and develop knowledge products in a number of areas, such as our scaling principles. And if you haven't had a chance to look at the resource page on our website, I'd urge you to do so and look at some of the working papers. This past spring, we just completed a series of about 28, I believe, case studies of mainstreaming, where we look primarily how international funders in development, but also implementing organizations, have integrated scaling into their work. And based on that, we've recently launched a campaign, and we call it the Mainstreaming Campaign, to really center scaling up as a core and fundamental principle and process in scaling. Today, I'm beyond delighted to have three superb speakers, and those of you who know me know I don't give praise lightly, to talk about scaling. We have with us people from three different organizations, all funding organizations. Two and a half funding organizations. First, Abe Grindle. Abe is a director of the programs team at Co-Impact, which oversees the $100 million grant portfolio there. For those of you who don't know Co-Impact, it's an extremely important player in big bet philanthropy, and works to bundle resources from a variety of funders to really support scaling up. Prior to his work at Co-Impact, and I've been reading Abe's work in Stanford Social Innovation Review and others for decades. He was a major advisor and player in the Bridgespan Group and really important in their scaling practice. We're also delighted to have today, and you will notice we are also having some alliteration today. All of the people speaking today's first names begin with A. So this is a triple A panel, okay, is Avery Bang. Avery is a partner at the Malago Foundation, and for those of you who don't know it, Malago has been at the cutting edge of supporting scaling. Its CEO, Kevin Starr, has written a large number of important pieces in the Stanford Social Innovation Review on the relationship between systems change and scaling, on what are the nuts and bolts of scaling. As Avery will share, they've developed a very simple but very powerful framework that emphasizes doers and payers. And Avery, in particular, in her role as a partner, leads efforts to identify and support the next generation of social entrepreneurs. Their model is a very much entrepreneur-driven model that if you get the right team in place, they will solve the many problems and pursue adaptive management that's involved in scaling. Last but not least, we have with us Anita Akello, who I've had the pleasure to work with closely myself for several years. Anita is the director for Impact at Scale at CARE, a $1 billion INGO, and has been working very hard for several years now to mainstream and integrate scaling into all of CARE's work, which I think she'll share that experience. She works with both technical teams in sectors and the country offices to design for scale and to build scale in. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Abe. Let me just say one more thing. We're going to have these three presentations, which will be about 10 to 15 minutes each. And then I will ask a few questions to get us started. And then we will take questions from the audience. We will ask you, if you're interested in a question, to put your question in the chat. And for those of you who haven't been here before, the chat is usually a very active source of discussion, and we encourage you to contribute there. So either ask a question or make a comment. Without further ado, Abe, please.
Really glad to be with everyone today. Let's see if we can get the presentation up and running here. All right, everyone, really excited to be here today. Thank you so much for making the time. I'm looking forward to the conversation because I think this is a topic that I think many of us are learning together in real time about what it looks like, what it takes, and what many of the challenges are for it. But I think it's really important for us all as we work to maximize impact, especially in this current context of development work. So I'm Abe, I'm from Co-Impact. For those who don't know Co-Impact, just a little bit of background here. We basically are a pooled philanthropic fund that supports, pools philanthropy from around the world and re-grants it to support local change leaders working to create durable impact at the scale of the problems they face, particularly focused on health, education, and economic opportunity, with a gender equality lens across all, as well as women's leadership in law and economics. For every grant we make, we have a three-part goal, which is durable change in public or market systems at the scale of the problem that will deliver concrete improvements in people's lives and women's power and agency. So that is the essence of our focus. I want to start with a little bit of like, why does durability matter? And I think many of us, certainly this is probably pretty intuitive and obvious, but I think it's worth perhaps reiterating, just because I think our sector has been on a trajectory of learning and growth over the last 20 years, say. And there's still plenty of efforts and initiatives that take a more kind of typical path. So that path looks like scaling up, sometimes rapidly, where indeed, maybe there is significant impact that happens. The effect size is strong and gets stronger over time. But unfortunately, all of that work is tied one-to-one explicitly to donor funding. And whenever donor funding runs out, the initiative basically disappears. So all we have is then a flash in the pan and nothing that endures to show for our work. Instead, when you talk about efforts that actually are able to achieve durable change for impact at scale, the trajectory looks more like this. And I want to point out, again, this is illustrative, of course. Every different effort is going to have its own path. But this illustrative picture paints a bit of some of the trends and patterns that I'm seeing and other colleagues that in the sector that are doing this work have seen. And I just want to note a few things here. First, if you look at the trajectory of scale, which are the rectangular bars, it can be slower at first. It can take longer to build the relationships and the partnerships needed to do this work. And then oftentimes it may go to scale very, very quickly when the government truly leans in, gets excited, and the political window of opportunity is open. The other thing I'll note is that oftentimes we see a really interesting curve when you look at effect size. So this is the orange-yellow curve here called impact. Oftentimes when you're at pilot, as we all know, you can get really nice effect sizes. You can maximize that in a way that is likely unrealistic and non-replicable at scale. And then as you get into a rapid scaling phase, the effect size often drops, especially when government or other actors take the lead. But then the key is to make sure that effect size doesn't drop to zero, of course, and continues to improve over time as you achieve kind of impact at full scale. So there is this trajectory, and where we measure impact along that path matters, because our expectations for what it looks like should align with the point on the trajectory that it's at. But the core idea here is that if you overlay the donor funding on top of this, the idea is that this impact, the scale, the effect sizes, et cetera, will continue long after donor funding winds down. It may or may not go to zero, depends very much on the context, but the idea is this: you do have enduring change that will continue to produce effective results and impact in people's lives for many, many more years to come, long after philanthropy winds down. So what this brings us to is an equation, and I'm an engineer by training originally, so I confess I do have a particular fondness for this, but for me, when I think about the trajectory of our sector over time, I think we've kind of gradually expanded our focus across the three dimensions of this equation, from what has been historically a focus maybe only on impact or predominantly on impact, again, which means effect size in an individual person's life. Scale has become more and more of the conversation over the last 10 to 15 years, which is great. And that's simply defined the number of people reached at one time. But I think where we're now getting into is this third component, which is durability, which is how, again, how long does the change in the system persist after donor funding really winds down, such that the system itself, whether it's the Ministry of Education or the market system or whatever it is in the context, continues to produce the great results, improved results in people's lives at scale, long for many years to come. Again, typically, we've only focused on impact or maybe impact and scale of these three components, and that's led to this path, this trajectory of these efforts that we all know very well. Instead, when we bring durability into the equation and make it co-equal alongside impact and scale, we get a trajectory that looks much more like this, that gives us the chance for sustaining, lasting impact at scale. So just to illustrate this with a couple very simple examples, right? Example one would be a typical approach. You have pretty high impact, 0.5 standard deviations. Let's say, just for illustrative sake, you reach 2 million people at scale. Let's say that's the primary school population of Zambia or something like that. And the durability of that effort, how long it lasts, because it's tied to donor funding, is 5 years. And after the 5-year program is done, it kind of disappears. Your total impact, your net units of impact that you get from that example is 5 million. So then if we take a different example below it, example number 2, if you have an effect size that's half example number 1, so 0.25 standard deviations at the same scale, 2 million, but it really has the durability piece cracked. It's of a cost, it's of a complexity that the Ministry of Education can run itself. The ministry sees it as their program, not someone else's. They have the motivation to do it. Let's say you're able to get that improved approach in the particular context for 15 years, that the ministry is able to run on its own, long after the donors are gone. Your total impact for that is more than 1/3, 50% greater even than it was for example number 1, so 7.5 million units of impact. A more realistic example of this is here. So typically, a higher effect size, a more impactful approach will have higher cost, right? That alone will typically lead to lower scale. So let's say the scale of example 1 is only 1 million. This is a more realistic scenario, I would say. It's much more common. In this scenario, the total impact from example 1 is only 2.5 million units. Whereas example number 2, smaller impact, smaller effect size, but greater scale because it's more cost effective, say, it's easier for government to take up. More durability because, again, the government sees it as their own, they have the capacity to do it, it's right sized. You get 3 times the total units of impact in this scenario, example 2 as example 1. So if you put that, let's say, again, just to be generous, that these are equally, the cost of these 2 is equal. Typically, example 1, the way it's done, it will be more expensive. Example 1 will often be more expensive. I'll say that again. The ROI, even if they are equally costly, is 3x for example number 2, where you really focus on that durability and you trade off a little bit of the effect size to get greater scale and greater durability. I think when we're talking about ROI and cost effectiveness in our sector, we don't bring durability into the equation often enough yet. So then if we unpack each of these 3 elements of the total impact equation, so impact, scale, and durability, what's underneath the surface of each? I think it's helpful to just take a moment and explicitly name these pieces, because it's easy to hit the headlines, but there are some secondary elements that are really important too. So under impact, we have, of course, the size of the effect, right? The standard deviations, the DALYs, whatever it might be in the particular context. But then there's also other considerations that are, equally or great, as much as important as that, which are things like the importance of the effect. How important is the issue? Are we talking about preventing gender-based violence in certain contexts, or are we talking about something else? What is the equity of the effect size? Oftentimes, as we know, the effect size of a given intervention is not the same across all demographics and all populations, nor all contexts. So what is the equity, let's say for women and girls, of the impact of a particular approach? How does that look in the broader context? And then finally, the longevity, the durability of the effect in an individual person's life. So if someone learns how to read, achieves kind of foundational literacy, how long does that impact last in their lives? All of those things kind of you could put under impact. Scale is relatively straightforward. It's reach. And I would say reach relative to the scale of the need. So to me, it's always a numerator denominator. What is the total population that has the need? And what scale are we relative to that need? And then inclusion as well, right? Like, are we reaching the most marginalized populations? Are we reaching women and girls? Are we reaching kind of the first mile or the last mile populations as well? And then finally, durability, right? So I think this one is the one that we've, as a sector, talked least about. Some of these are much more common and well known, I think. So when you talk about the technical operational durability, sustainability, does the system have the capacity to do this work in the long run? Who is the doer at scale, as Mulago would say? And do they have what it takes in order to do the work and continue the work long after the NGOs or the donors are gone? Is it financially durable? Again, we talk about this a lot as a sector. Is it sustainable financially? Is there a payer at scale, in Mulago's language? Then is it politically durable? Because even if in theory you have a payer at scale, do they have the political motivation, incentives to really kind of embrace it, to continue to invest in it, and so forth? Fourth, under durability, you have this factor that I think is underappreciated, but potentially one of the most important drivers of, do you actually get kind of durable change, which is, what is the sense of ownership and motivation amongst the doers and payers at scale? Oftentimes, in many cases, we're talking about government. Do they see a particular effort, initiative, product, program as their thing? Or do they see it as, this is just another NGO program, USAID program, etc., that we will tolerate? It's nice to have, we're glad to have it, but this isn't ours. And they'll come back in 5 years with another one, just like they always do and have done for decades, right? Like, that fundamental mindset difference, right, is hugely important when it comes to government's ability and willingness to run with something for the long run. And the motivation piece is another aspect of that. What are the motivations of all of the different actors within, again, often a government system? How do they think about the particular effort or initiative? Do they see it as theirs and something that is important in their work, in their world, or less so? And then finally, of course, norms and mental models. That could be as simple but profound as a mental model amongst teachers and head teachers and frontline government ministry officials of, can all children learn? Do we believe that? Or do we think, actually, no, only 10% of children can learn? That's a mental model that, depending on how that shifts, can have significant implications for the durability of a given initiative at scale. So again, here, I'll start to go a little bit more quickly as I wrap up. For durability, there are several aspects that we talked about a little bit here that are really important, right? The first and the foremost, I would say, is it really has to be owned by the system and has to be seen as their work, not outsiders. That helps it to be durable over time, including transitions at all levels of government or the system, with the incentives and the political and community constituencies, civil society constituencies that have a vested interest and are willing to put in the time and effort to keep it in place, and ideally to help pushing to keep improve it. For example, again, let's talk about literacy results in primary schools. Do parents know what those results are? They care. Almost every parent everywhere in the world cares about, are their kids learning how to read in primary school? And certain initiatives that I've seen, there's an initiative by Le Mans Foundation in Brazil, based on the Sobral model, which has a huge media component that publishes literacy results every year, every time the tests are taken at a national level. And that has had a significant impact on the motivation of teachers, school leaders, government officials, et cetera, to keep investing in it, because the parents and the broader community are very much vested in keeping that work going. Third, is it locally sustainable? Can it continue without donor funding? Fourth, is it designed for the realities of the system at scale, right? We can make anything work at small scale, but at full national scale or state level scale in India or places like that, do the finances, the human resources, the technical capacity, the data systems, are those able to do what's needed for the work at scale in a way that will endure? And finally, related to that, we can have beautiful, complex, complicated measurement systems that will give us 1,000 data points, but those will collapse under their own weight as soon as donor funding is gone, if they even get that far. How can we ensure that you have just enough key data and data analysis, sense-making, decision-making processes to enable good decisions and continuous improvement? That long tail of continuous improvement that we need to see. So what does this require from change leaders? On the right-hand side, these are some of the key characteristics that we've seen in our work over 10 years supporting these kinds of efforts. One, it's a long-term perspective and persistence. These are 7 to 15-year efforts to get this in place. It's not a 3 to 4 year project in most cases. There are certain exceptions where maybe you can get a quicker result, but that is very, very rare and uncommon. Secondly, oftentimes you really need committed local leaders with the patience, the standing, and the agency to do this work. And as part of this, especially for international donors, there's a lot of devolution of power that comes with it. Like, this has to be these committed change leaders strategies, not the international donor strategies. Third, you have to have strategic patience and flexibility. For any of this work, it's deeply political. It must be adaptive. You have to play the long game. And that piece of ownership, this is where this really comes in. To have governments see this as theirs rather than just another NGO's projects, that means they have to be in the driver's seat in many instances. And that may mean going slower at times in order for government to kind of go through their processes, learn how to do it, put in the changes in place in their processes that are required in order to get that result. And that may take 2 or 3 times longer than it would take for an NGO to just go and do it themselves. But by and large, when this is the kind of work one wants to do, that's the approach that really is essential. And when either change leaders or donors kind of try to force the issue and force a quicker pace, it can undermine and really kind of completely destroy any hope to build that sense of ownership and leadership and responsibility on government side. So you really have to go at the pace of the system. And sometimes that also means going quickly. When the government gets excited about things, they may say, hey, we want to go to national scale in 2 years, right? And that may be crazy. It may make the quality kind of really take a hit. But the idea is oftentimes you have to advise, but go along and work with the grain of the system and really lean into that continuous improvement effort over time to allow that to eventually result in the total impact that we all want. Fourth, this is about, again, continuous improvement. It's not going to be perfect, particularly in moments of rapid scale up. And finally, to do this work, it really requires low ego, no logos, a servant leader type of approach, which again can present a real tension for change leaders, especially when donors, there's a sense of scarcity, there may be a sense of competition, there is this sense of needing to continuously prove oneself. Donors have to do everything we can to really put that out of the picture and really encourage this type of servant leadership approach in the service of the system, the long-term change at scale. So I'll just conclude on this, and we'll have some examples that Avery and Anita will give next. So just a few closing notes. One, just to state the obvious, this type of work is not possible everywhere. I think we all understand that. But where it is possible, I think it really deserves deep consideration and thought. Secondly, really importantly, different types of systems and goals will have different types of trajectories. So if you're trying to improve how an existing Ministry of Education system, let's say, is teaching literacy in primary school, where you have an existing system, existing workforce, existing budget, etc., and you're just trying to tweak it, make it work a little bit better, that's one thing. It will have a certain trajectory. If you're trying to get an existing system, let's say a Ministry of Health, to kind of expand the scope of what it takes on, a new disease area, a new geographic focus, or oftentimes, let's say, a new workforce of the community health workers in many contexts, right? Like that is an existing system, but you're talking about additional budget, additional responsibilities. That's a different type of work. It will have a different trajectory. And finally, when you're working on something that's building almost a new system where one hasn't existed before, ECD and care is a prime example of this in most contexts. That is its own type of work, and it will have its own trajectory. I will say durable change is possible in all three cases in many places, not everywhere, but many places, but it will look different. The path will look different. The trajectory will look different. So having a nuanced conversation about this, I think, is important. Third, and I'll conclude here, there are always opportunities for continuous improvement beyond kind of the 7 to 15 year kind of work to put this in place. New opportunities emerge, new geographies emerge, additional governments want support. So just to say that in a particular initiative, when donor funding may wind down appropriately so, that's not to say that there aren't follow-on initiatives that are even higher impact oftentimes that won't merit significant donor funding, even as a particular constrained effort in one geography may have the path that we've described. So I'll leave it there, and I'll turn it over to Avery next, I think, for some additional thoughts.
All right, well, just to get us going, I want to build on Abe's good thinking. And I'm obviously here representing Malago Foundation today. And we think of ourselves as really early stage scouts. How do we go find those new next big ideas? And we think of this as like a design problem. And the way that I originally met Anita was kind of having this nice, healthy debate is if you don't start from the beginning designing for that durability, designing for scale, is it really possible to get there? So that's maybe what I'm going to kind of help walk us through a little bit today. Is if we start with thinking about most organizations, we looked at 5,000 unique nominations last year. Just being able to say that you get the same impact over time is actually pretty good. Over time, if it can get better and you can incrementally make more efficiencies of scale, organizations that can do that are exceptional. I think the effective altruism movement is doing a great job of funding these kinds of organizations. But what Malago is looking for is this uncoupling, like kind of making sure that philanthropy and impact are decoupled. And so if you can kind of imagine, there's this future state, just like Abe went through, and there's this durability element that once philanthropy stops or sustains, that impact becomes exponential. And that's what I'm here to talk about. If you in the beginning think that this is what we want to happen, the most important question is who is doing it and who is paying for it up in this dream state. Designing for your doer and your payer. And so at our retreats every year, we like to start with this group of fellows and say, okay, you've got these 4 options for your doers. It could be you, it could be your government, it could be a bunch of NGOs, it could be lots of businesses, but there's only 4. And punchline, just to get ahead of it, it's never you. The exception are few, but there's really not that many organizations or ideas that have ever been solving a problem as a single organization. And similarly, we believe that there's very few, if any, example NGOs solving problems. You really only have governments and businesses as scalable features. And the second question we ask our early stage entrepreneurs is, if you're designing for this dream state, you have to think about who is going to pay for this big idea. And again, you really only have 4 options: philanthropy, government, big aid, and customers. And again, just to get to the punchline, for most ideas, philanthropy is but a drop in the bucket. You're not going to solve the problem globally or even make a meaningful dent in the size of that if you believe that the only way that you're going to achieve that outcome is for philanthropy forever paying for it. And more recently at Malago, we've come up with a second kind of cross out, which is big aid. And obviously what's happened in the last year, this has become all the more acute. But envisioning a future where foreign ODA is funding these ideas is meaning that you're probably designing a solution that is not cheap enough for the payer to pay. It has to probably be government or a customer solution. And so as you couple these two things together, and we've got all of our fellows kind of excitingly thinking about how they're going to actually scale and decouple philanthropy from impact, you're really landing on a reality that has just governments as a government scale strategy, or lots of businesses and customers as your scale strategy. So just to reiterate what Abe said, at Malago, we think about impact certainly at effect size and reach, but this duration or this durability, I saw in the chat earlier, some people call it sustainability. We have that on Malago's banned word list, words that get overused and start to mean nothing. So I think duration or durability starts to actually give a little teeth to what we're talking about. And specifically at Malago, we're really interested in this future state where government is both doing and paying for the idea. And you have to start to think about, maybe there are ratcheting down of this probability of success, or perhaps even the effect size might go down, as Abe mentioned. But it's something that we think, as taking a step back, is the only and best way to invest philanthropy. It is unequivocally the most cost-effective interventions out there. So I come today with a little bit of a doer background. Richard mentioned my role at Malago as finding and running the coaching teams, but I come to this really genuinely as first a doer. I spent 15 years building FICA, previously called Bridges to Prosperity, an organization that was both funded, continues to be funded by cost-effective donors like GiveWell, as well as scale-oriented organizations like Malago. And a little shout out to Anita. I think the role of big NGOs is actually something that I come from a deep appreciation and collaboration with. Is the very first idea for my organization actually spawned out of Helvetas in Nepal, where they had built 10,000 trail bridges. And the idea of FICA came together with, how do you actually make that a global initiative? So what the heck is FICA? Our big idea is last mile trail bridges. And we believe from the Malago framework that doer, being the government procuring these bridges with contractors locally, and governments paying for this work, was actually how we are going to break the rural access problem. What FICA does in the beginning, as the NGO, is siting, designing, financing, and maintaining. But what the government does in the long run, when they are the doer, is they site, they design, they finance, and they maintain. Something we spend a tremendous amount of time with all of our fellows in the early design stage is, what exactly do you have to do now, and what exactly does your doer at scale have to do? You'd be shocked how many interventions and how many people are not clear about exactly what they have to do. And if it's not simple enough for you to do, it's simple, and you're not designing for simple enough for your doer to do, you'll never get the doer to do it. So in FICA's example, getting the doer to do, getting that government to build, was a long-standing priority. But you can see, as Bridges to Prosperity started to grow more of their orange bridges, meaning they actually have humans and boots on the ground, the real effort and the real priority was getting the governments to procure that infrastructure and to train local contractors to build it themselves. I wish I had an updated 2026 slide. You would be really blown out of the water at what my successor, Nivi Sharma, has pulled off. It's remarkable. And that's important, because not only is getting governments to do something on their own a remarkable achievement, but it has to mean something. It has to have an effect size that matters. And there are 2 control trials on this. Just for the sake of going quickly, I'll point out the first, where there's a 29% increase in household level income when you get a bridge compared to control communities when you do not. And when you're reaching now this year over 5.4 million people, that results in quite a bit of not only economic growth, but of course, there's a number of secondary effects around health and education as well. But the most exciting part, guys, is there's two parts of how we think about durability. Sure, these orange bridges, the ones that the V2P builds, they're cost effective. They create huge income gains, and they're going to last for 30 years. That's wow. But now let's think about that government keeps building. Going back to that Helvetas Nepal example, 10,000 bridges. That ROI on putting a little bit of philanthropy up front to build in this system and get governments to actually do this is outsized and unparalleled. The second part that we care deeply about, not only getting the government to do, it's getting the government to pay. And I think that this is where Richard encouraged me to make it very clear to everyone, this is not a linear A to B path. Things are very squirrely and never goes to plan. But you can start to get notional appreciation that as you move into new countries, whether it's in the Rwandan context in the very beginning, we said, can you co-finance at a national level program? 50% of philanthropy will come in. Will you match 1-to-1? That was a huge achievement for us back in 2020. But once we got more evidence and we worked with different governments to figure out where we should go next, Ethiopia came in and said, hey, we'll put in 80%. So again, taking a step back, ROI of philanthropy, every dollar you bring into Ethiopia is getting matched, kind of a 5-to-1. And I think impressively, again, what the FICA team is doing today is actually removing themselves and removing philanthropy almost entirely from the equation, which is a great achievement. Another example from Malago's current portfolio is Healthy Learners. And their big idea is teachers at frontline health workers, again, with a government doer and government payer scale strategy. This particular one, Lonnie designed from day one to say that teachers are already on payroll. They're already in front of the kids that are going to be needing those health services the most. Can we just retool and resupply them to be that frontline health worker? Their model, again, what they did in the beginning, but what they designed for their doer to do at scale was to get teachers as health workers, design these health rooms, put tech in for diagnostics, make sure that every student has a buddy. And as those kids that need to be referred into the health system arrive, make sure that they are fast-tracked. They're not going to go spend all day in that clinic. And I think for Healthy Learners, getting government payroll teachers was the most efficient way they could imagine actually solving this problem. And you can see just over the last 4 to 5 years, they've been able to show that the number of kids that are having their frontline first touch with a teacher as opposed to the health system has gained significant traction. They're currently moving towards national scale in Zambia. And I think this is important. It not only takes people out of the health system, which is already overloaded, but it also makes kids healthier. And so as they start to think about impact for them, this is they're still waiting on their RCT for 27. So this is a bit outdated, but we're looking at a 38% reduction in all-cause mortality for schools that have these frontline health workers as teachers. And they're reaching 1.2 million kids in Zambia. So that is consequential. But the most important question is, if Healthy Learners removes their efforts and removes their work, will this continue? Malago, we're making the bet. They absolutely will. Time will tell. And I think this is important. Again, it's messy, to Richard's point. It's like this is not going to go from A to B. But Lonnie started in 2013 with the idea that I don't need to create a parallel health system. And I certainly don't need to have a parallel workforce that goes on payroll. And he has had a journey of proving that it's scaling, getting first district level ownership to prove out that this is possible, getting national level mandates. And in 2026, he's already been able to say for every new school to add a health room as part of the CDF funded schools, which is remarkable. So in closing, these are two of our probably prime examples, but we have a portfolio of 85 or so organizations and 20 new every single year that come in as fellows. And so we really do believe that this durability function is something that is not an exception. It is something we should and could design for. And we really would encourage the whole space to start early and think about starting from the start. And then Anita, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Everything that Avery and Abe talked about, we believe. These are not the traditional ways that INGOs have thought or operated, mainly because of how the incentives in our sector were structured. But at CARE, we are actively grappling with how to change the way we design, work, and define success so that we can achieve the durable scale that maximizes impact and solves the challenges that our sector is trying to solve. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we've been, where we are, and where we're heading. So CARE started delving deeply into understanding scale in 2020. We had a large portfolio of interventions that were successful by the conventional metrics that any INGO would use, meaning they had evidence of impact, they had years of donor support, and they'd been replicated in multiple contexts. But few of these solutions had actually been taken up and sustained by the doers and payers that ultimately have to deliver and finance results in the long run: governments, markets, and civil society organizations. So while there was meaningful impact, it was largely limited by CARE's footprint and by the availability of grant funding. So the impact that we were achieving did not match the scale of the challenges that we were trying to solve. So we decided to rigorously examine a question that is hard to ask because it's uncomfortable. Why aren't more solutions scaling? And why doesn't impact grow and endure without grant funding? So we analyzed 17 of our most promising interventions, and we came to a sobering realization, which was that many legacy interventions, which had been developed as grant-funded programs, were not designed in a way that local doers and payers could sustainably adopt, implement, and pay for at scale. For instance, one of our interventions addressing gender-based violence had generated strong RCT results, but scaling it nationally in the country where it was developed would have cost the government roughly $75 million, while the Lion Ministry's annual budget was about $2.5 million. And in another case, we demonstrated the value of a powerful climate adaptation tool across roughly 20 countries, and governments believed in its value. But when we asked them to adopt and finance it themselves, almost all of them told us that it cost too much, it took too long, and it required analytical capabilities that they didn't have. So in both of these cases, the problem wasn't evidence. It wasn't a lack of advocacy. The problem was design. On the other hand, we've also had solutions that have spread beyond CARE, and savings groups are probably the best example of this. Savings groups were co-created in 1991 by women community members in Niger and CARE, and over the last 30 plus years, they've spread organically through communities, through NGOs, and eventually governments. And today, national governments in 15 countries have embedded savings group in their poverty reduction and financial inclusion policies, and 11 of them continue to engage CARE for technical support as they further institutionalize and expand the model. So why did this scale? The difference wasn't necessarily better evidence. It was that the model could realistically be adopted, implemented, financed, and sustained by local actors because it was simple. Community members can form and manage the groups themselves after an initial investment. It was affordable. Groups are mostly self-financed, and you can expand groups through government systems and structures that already exist. And it's cost-effective. By year 5, savings groups yield an estimated $18 for every dollar invested. So it's a high return model that makes sense for communities and makes sense for government. But across our legacy portfolio, this was the exception, not the rule. The reason that most legacy interventions weren't scaling, we realized, was that they weren't designed to be scalable. They weren't simple enough for local doers to implement, affordable enough for local payers to finance, or cost-effective enough to be the best use of scarce resources. Coming to that realization was painful, and sitting with it was also painful. But I am grateful that we were willing to confront it. And I don't think that what we found is unique to CARE. In fact, I suspect that many INGO interventions are too complex and costly to scale, because with the abundant external resources that we now realize we had, our sector had the luxury of growing impactful solutions that were like a flower grown with all the very best inputs in a greenhouse. But then we'd ask local systems to do the same when they most often have a desert, not a greenhouse. So that's on us. And I've come to believe that when we achieve impact with a ton of grant money, all we've proven is that we can achieve impact with a ton of grant money. But the harder and more important question is whether local doers and payers can then sustain those results at scale without external funding. So this realization is reshaping how we at CARE think about design, about partnership versus ownership, and even about our own role. You know, a government may believe that a solution is impactful, but if it can't realistically pay for it or deliver it within existing systems, the solution won't scale or endure. So if we believe that scale and institutionalization matter, then designing solutions that fit those realities is our responsibility. So there are three implications. The first is that how we design changes. Instead of starting with legacy interventions and asking how to scale them, we're starting with that future state or the dream state in mind. So that means asking, what problem is government trying to solve? What does the sector's best evidence say can solve it? Who will be the doer? Who will be the payer? And importantly, what would need to be true for the local system to own, operate, finance, and expand the solution after CARE is gone? So in other words, we're shifting from designing interventions for our delivery to designing for local system ownership and for our own exit. Secondly, how we work changes. Rather than developing solutions and introducing them to governments and local systems later, we're bringing governments, private sector actors, and other system stakeholders into the design process from the beginning, because having them shape the solution with us from day one is the best way to ensure that it actually fits within their goals, their context, their constraints, and their incentives. And we're being very clear with these local stakeholders that we are there to support them to build something they can own, deliver, and finance themselves. And we're being clear about our own exit. And finally, CARE's role evolves because it has to, if local networks are ultimately going to own the solutions. You know, we have to stop thinking of ourselves as a long-term implementer and start thinking of ourselves as a system enabler, a scaling partner, and a technical advisor. And CARE does bring deep strengths that put us in a strong position to play this role. We have long-standing relationships with government, we have last mile reach, and we have a nuanced understanding of the interdependencies that shape complex development challenges. And the question we're working through now is, how do we deploy those strengths in a way that complements and strengthens local systems versus substituting for them? So that means helping local doers and payers identify effective solutions, adapt them to local realities, and build the capabilities needed to actually sustain and expand that impact. So what this adds up to for us is that we're changing our definition of success. It's not enough for CARE to deliver impact. The real test is whether others can sustain and scale that impact after we leave. And under this new way of thinking, if CARE succeeds, it will not be because of what we scale ourselves. It will be because of what others are able to scale because of us. So I'll share a little bit about what this looks like in practice. All right. Our lean market-based sanitation work in Zambia is our first intentional effort to design for scale, institutionalization, and duration from the start. And we're doing this work in deep collaboration with IDE and ID Insight. We're thinking of our pilot, which is in the early stages, as a pilot for scale, or jokingly, we call it a cactus pilot because it's adapted for the desert rather than the greenhouse. But it's a short, lean, 9-month pilot that's built around rapid learning cycles. And rather than investing heavily up front, we're trying to learn as quickly as possible what works, what doesn't, and what needs to change before larger investments are made. And the goal is not to prove ultimate impact, because a 9-month long pilot is not long enough to measure that. And instead, what we're looking for is evidence that we're moving in the right direction towards sanitation outcomes, and that what we're building is something local actors can sustain and grow with local resources. Because, as you've heard, duration doesn't happen automatically. You have to design for it. In Zambia, fewer than 40% of rural households have access to basic sanitation, but the government hopes to reach 90% by 2030. And responsibility for achieving that goal sits with the National Water and Sanitation Utility. But rural sanitation is a relatively new area for them, and in our conversations, they and local governments have been eager to work together to identify a model that can succeed in their context and sustain within their system. And in sanitation, the challenge isn't that people don't want good toilets that last or that those don't exist. The challenges are distributed across a whole system. It's things like weak supply chains, limited access to finance, affordability constraints, and coordination gaps. And so that is why we think of sanitation as a system rather than a product. And because it's a system, demand generation, supply development, and system strengthening all have to be addressed, because no matter how much you simplify the intervention, and what you see on the slide is a simplified version, the system only works when all three are functioning at the same time. And importantly, there's no single actor for whom it makes sense to do all of these things or pay for all of these things at scale. So we're asking those questions that focus on the future state. Which local system actor is best positioned to lead on each function? And which actor has the incentive and the capability to sustain it? Who should ultimately pay for it? And what combination of actors is going to give us the best chance of building something that lasts? We're still working through that analysis with government, private sector, and civil society partners, but our current thinking is that for some functions, government will do and pay. Where there's a market mechanism at play, markets will lead. For others, communities and civil society will be best positioned to lead. And in almost every case, multiple actors will need to work together. And looking at the system in this way actually also clarifies our role, because our job is to work with these future owners to arrive at an evidence-based model that fits their realities and meets their objectives, strengthen their ability to deliver it effectively, and then continuously improve the model's effectiveness, affordability, and scalability, and then ultimately to exit. Another thing we're testing in this work is whether combining the complementary strengths of IDE, CARE, and ID Insight, while leaving egos and logos at the door, can help the model go further, faster, and be more sustainable. So IDE brings one of the sector's strongest and most scalable MBS models and deep expertise in supply development. CARE brings strong community connections, the platform of savings groups, deep government relationships, and experience working across complex and connected systems. And ID Insight helps ensure we're measuring the right things, learning quickly, and being honest about what's working or not. We're also building an M&E system, which is still in development, that measures more than movement towards sanitation outcomes. We'll be tracking indicators of scalability to understand whether local actors can implement the model, finance it, and sustain it, and whether we're making it more affordable and cost-effective as we iterate. So what this whole journey has fundamentally shifted for us is how we define success. It's not about how effectively we deliver programs. It's about whether what we support can be owned, financed, and sustained by local systems, and that's the direction that we're actively working towards. Before I close, I'll just share a few resources that we've developed along the way. The scaling playbook has the methods and tools that we developed with ID Insight to analyze our own legacy interventions. The Lean Market-Based Sanitation blog is a space where we're learning in public with honesty as we try to work in these new ways while designing for durable scale in Zambia. And the systems orchestration playbook, which we developed with Geneva Global, is forthcoming. But this lays out a practical process for effectively engaging the right system actors, co-defining that desired future state, and mapping what it'll take to get there. So that's where I'll end. Thanks so much, and I'll hand it back over to Richard.
Thank you so much, the three of you. This was really fabulous. I knew this was going to be one of our best webinars, and haven't been disappointed. Before I think there's a lot of richness here, and I'd like to unpack it. But before I get into that, I just want to, I think, make something very clear, at least my interpretation for the audience, but I want to validate it with the three of you. I know, Abe, in your little equation, and that sounded condescending, but your simple equation, impact, durability, and scale. One could have come away with the impression that you were against impact. And I don't think that's what you were saying. I think what you were saying was that we really need to emphasize scalability, and that there's trade-offs, usually trade-offs, not always. There are some because high impact tends to correlate with complex and expensive. And those things tend not to be scalable in developing countries that have weak implementation capacity and weak fiscal capacity, or even if it's a private sector pathway, there's only so much that consumers can pay. So would it be correct and maybe you could go first, Abe, and the others could come in to say you're not against impact, you'd love to have high impact, but you're not willing to go all in on impact because if it's not scalable, if it's not durable, if it can't be implemented over time at large scale, that's not the trade-off you want to make. And that traditionally the development sector has been like a 10 on impact and a 1 and a 1 on scale and durability. And 10 times 1 times 1 is not big number, but 5 times 5 times 5 is a big number. And so the perfect is the enemy of the good. So please say what you'd like to say.
I just affirm what you just said, Richard. I mean, to me, it's an optimization problem, and it's just making sure that one considers all three of the variables co-equally and comes up with the best way to maximize the sum total, right? Like, so, and it will look different in different scenarios, right? Like if one can really get 0.5, 0.8 standard deviations of impact at scale in a way that's durable, that's the holy grail. I mean, we would all love that. Like that is absolutely what we aspire to. But I think it's the key thing is being conscious that we consider all three variables and consider them equally, right? Like it's just a simple math, it is a simple math equation, right? Like maximizing only one of the variables, whichever one it is, isn't like that doesn't do us anything, like that doesn't do us justice, right? Like it's how do we maximize all three in order to maximize total impact with the given constraints, context, situations, and so forth that we're working in. So that's all I'd say. Thank you.
Anita or Avery, would you like to come in on that? Or enough said, move on?
I think Abe got that one from Ryan.
Yeah, that was a great answer. I think one thing I'll say, one thing I can validate is this is the part that is hardest for technical teams, right? Like sort of doing this, like grappling with the trade-offs. I do agree that there should be probably a minimum standard for impact, right? That if like 90 impact units were delivered in the original delivery, that you probably don't want only 5 to be delivered when it make it so simple that only 5 are delivered. But I think that, so just verifying that this is the part that's hardest is grappling with these trade-offs, right?
So I want to, that was a beautiful answer because it led to the question I wanted to ask. So thank you, Anita. I think there are many important points here, but you use the word, Anita, technical teams. And traditionally in big aid, INGO implemented things, there's a bunch of people with PhDs or degrees in engineering who design this stuff. And they know how to, and if you're an agronomist or a civil engineer or an education expert or a health expert, you have in your mind not how do I maximize scalability and durability, but how do I lower maternal mortality? How do I increase income? And that's what you were trained to do for 20 years in education. So I guess 2 questions. It seems to me that what is the role of technical experts, or how do we get technical experts on the one hand to emphasize scalability and durability and reframe their mental thinking, or given the emphasis on what I would think you all emphasized on localization, local ownership, local trials, maybe we need to be moving away from technical experts. So could you talk about what you see as the who is designing this stuff, and how can we move in a direction where those 3 things, I'm speaking very pragmatically here, because, I'm sure CARE has an education team and a health team and all the sectors that it works in. And so how do we sort of move this forward practically? I mean, we're talking about a really different paradigm shift in who designs the interventions that end up being scaled. Maybe I'll start with you, Anita.
So I will say that I think that you've undersold the technical teams a bit, because they don't sit in an ivory tower. They don't just sit in a room and come up with this stuff, right? Like they have iterated and they have worked in the field and they have seen that it yields significant impact. It's just that the things that they were being asked to solve for were effect size and reach, right? They weren't necessarily being asked to solve for durability and to think in terms of total impact units, right? And so I wonder, and it should be easy to understand why they are committed to their interventions and why the trade-offs are hard. It's because they've seen them work. But it's this idea that they worked in a greenhouse, but what we've got is a desert. And if we don't design for the desert, it's not going to, we're never going to solve the problem. Like, yes, those 100 ladies are going to come and tell you that you made their life much better, but it's not going to achieve impact at the scale that we need it to. So I think that, so maybe it's a matter of, changing their own perception of what they're solving for, like this, like this equation does, and saying, okay, you got to solve for all three of these variables.
Right. Well, you've been using the desert and the green box, but if I can offer a slightly different metaphor, what I like to call this is actually thinking inside the box. The box are the doer and payer constraints in terms of implementation capacity and financial resources. And I want to come back to that, but Avery, you mentioned that Malago has a portfolio of 80. I mean, you must have thought about this a lot. How do you, who are the people who are, how would you characterize the people who are developing these interventions that presumably you're vetting on these three criteria? Are they PhDs in education or health or agricultural economists, or are they entrepreneurs? I mean, what's your take on the who here?
I think a lot of people start as that technical expert in the ivory tower. I certainly did. Kind of had this idea that I could go get a graduate degree and I could come up with some specific insight that other people couldn't have. And I see that a lot, both with entrepreneurs in the social impact space, as well as I think in some of the people we partner with bigger NGOs. But one of the things that we had to have as a mindset shift, Richard, was we had to say, how do you get the engineering out of the engineering? How do you make it so simple enough for the doer to do, that the design constraint is how do you get the standard operating procedures? And let's use the bridge example. We used to kind of pithily go into ministries of infrastructure and say, we want to be helping you be the Department of Transportation for rural infrastructure. We want to get it so it's a green bridge, a blue bridge, a yellow bridge. And this is not first principles design exercise. This is like a go through a table, the span and the height difference. And I think that that's kind of illustrative, because in the beginning, you want to say, well, I can customize and make this exceptional and I can make the effect size maximized. But the reality is, if you're designing for durability, you have to say, well, how do you get these experts out of the equation? And how do you make it so the experts are incentivized, to use Anita's point, to make it so you can remove yourself from the equation? And that's hard work. But we see that across almost every single person that comes into our fellowship, many of whom have PhDs and technical expertise as they come in.
Abe, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add the angle of incentives, right? Like, so one of the questions you asked, Richard, was why? Like, why is it? And I think funders have a big responsibility, right? Like, and I think have driven a lot of the incentives and behavior that have left scale and durability out of the core design constraints and considerations historically, right? Like, I think that's what got rewarded in the past, right? Like, and so I think, to me, like, and I'll, like, I'm an engineer, like, you have to name the design constraints, right? Like, that's 101, right? Like, it's like, let's all be clear about what is the problem we're trying to solve, because it is a fundamentally different problem if you say only solve for effect size. So I'll use a very simple analogy, right? Like, if you're telling me cook a great meal to feed 10 people, okay, there's 1,000 ways I could do that, right? If you're saying cook a great meal for 10,000 people, there's a much smaller universe of solutions, right, to achieve that goal. If you're saying cook a great meal for 1 million people that somebody else can cook perpetually every day for the next 10 years, right? Like, those are three fundamentally different problems, right? Like, so it's not a failure on the chef's part, right? Like, to solve one way, or they're just different problems. So I would say that especially funders have not been properly specifying the problem, the solutions that we want to support. And that has caused and incentivized a lot of challenging behavior, reporting dynamics, requirements, et cetera, that has made it very difficult for doers to focus equally on impact, scale, and durability all at the same time, because that is the hardest problem. Let's be clear. There's no two ways about that.
Well, let me ask this. I'm going to play the devil's advocate a little bit. By the way, I'm totally on board with this, and I've been saying many of the things you do have for a while. But um, a few minutes ago, I used the analogy of thinking inside the box. What are the system's constraints? But some might argue, well, why don't we build a bigger box? In other words, why aren't we working to, the world, all the MDBs, those system strengthening, capacity building, so they mobilize greater fiscal capacity. So you guys are thinking too short term, and shouldn't we be working on systems change to allow for more higher effect size innovations or interventions to be scaled? What do you think about that argument? I see you nodding, Avery. You want to go first?
Yeah. I mean, maybe back to the example that I had with Helvitas, I think big NGOs have a really critical role to play with governance and system strengthening within this, like within the ministries. Most of our social entrepreneurs think about it's a big enough question. Where can I go where my solution will have momentum? We don't want to go for a solution to die. And finding organizations that can partner with governments over the long run are often much bigger, often have been there and have the credibility. And we think of it as like a step ladder of a partnership. How do you come in with a Ministry of Education that has been working with CARE for 20 years and parlay that relationship and that expertise, but help bring this like kind of agile, nimble, specific kind of intervention to play? And I think they're not mutually exclusive in some sense. You cannot go into a government that doesn't have the capacity. Like Malago just categorically does not work in fragile contexts. Wish we could, but you really need to make sure that that governance work is there before you get going.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Abe or Anita, I mean, Anita, you guys, CARE works a lot on capacity building and system strengthening. What do you see as the relationship between trying to maximize or solve the optimization problem of between the three things and the trade-offs between effect size? I mean, I guess it's not just an optimization problem, but it's an intertemporal optimization problem.
Sure. Well, one thing I want to clarify is that I think that, on one of Abe's slides, he said that it is sort of, you have to be planning for a 7 to 15-year time horizon, right? And just to clarify, sort of building on what Avery said, I also don't know that we're the person to take it, or the entity to take it to 15 years, right? I think that we have an important, I think that, first of all, I think that both of the things that you talked about, the box has to be made bigger and you have to build inside the box at the same time, because I worry about if we just wait to build the box bigger before we start actually doing things, like problems are getting worse, things need to be solved, etc. But I think that INGOs can certainly work on both, and there's sort of a scaling intermediary role that we can play, right? Like sort of taking these solutions that have been proven to work, maybe by a smaller organization, and where there's a gap between a promising solution and a system that can actually own it, we can work in those situations to identify the solutions, like map solutions to problems that local systems are trying to solve, work with them to adapt those solutions to local realities while also changing the enabling environment, et cetera, to sort of, as you were saying, make the box bigger, and then actually do the work with them of figuring out what it would take for them to deliver, finance, and sustain them. And by playing that role, we can help de-risk larger investments by, say, governments and multilateral institutions that can come in as the next actor by ensuring that these solutions are adapted, tested, and embedded for scale before those big additional resources are committed to institutionalization. So I think that we have there's like a dovetail on this end and a dovetail on that end. And I think that we're well situated because of the relationships we have with governments and communities and our understanding of complex systems to play that role in the middle.
So Abe, I'd like to invite you to come in on this, but before you do, I want to up the ante a little bit. It seems from what both Avery and Anita were saying, and I'm wondering if you agree with this, that we might be underinvesting in systems change and institutionalization. So how do you view these issues of systems change and scaling and institutionalization, and are we doing enough, or should we be doing both? I mean, there's only so much money. I mean,
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of thoughts. One is I just want to add to the last conversation on like I do think and agree that I think INGOs can play a helpful role, right? Like I think we haven't had a nuanced enough as a sector, a nuanced enough conversation about where and when and under what circumstances INGOs versus local actors are the best people to lead, right? Like, and I don't think there's a one size fits all approach, but I do think there's a hugely capable universe of local actors. This is almost overwhelmingly who Co-Impact supports, that are capable and are achieving and leading on this kind of work. In some ways, I think some of them are leapfrogging what at least the traditional INGO aid approach, you know, also the RTIs and Chemonics and all of the world like have done, right? Like, and I think in part it's because of the paradigms each have worked in. So I just want to name that of like, I think there is a hugely capable ecosystem of local NGOs that really the binding constraint on their capacity right now today, which is different than it may have been 10 or 15 years ago, is resources and resources towards this kind of work. So we're hugely optimistic around that and very encouraged. On this question of scale, systems change, I don't think it's a, I think sometimes we get tripped up a little bit in binaries that may not be as binary as on the surface, right? So to me, it's a continuum, right? Like, and I think I at the very end of my presentation, I mentioned 3 different types of change at scale. One is where you're trying to tweak how an existing system is working, like how a Ministry of Education is delivering foundational literacy in primary school. Another example is where you're trying to expand the scope of what an existing system is taking on, like a Ministry of Health taking on a community health worker system, right? And a third example is where you're trying to really almost build a new system where one doesn't exist today. So whether that's care and ECD in many contexts where it's been reliant on unpaid care work by women primarily, whether it's more kind of sanitation work and all of that, like I think that's a more nuanced and appropriate kind of type of dimension to kind of talk about. There are efforts to build horizontal and strengthen horizontal capabilities in governments. So say something like the open government partnership work, the open contracting work, the international budget partnership work, things that are trying to strengthen kind of across government key enabling capabilities. I think those are really important. Tim Hanstead, among other people, has been talking a lot, and Chandler Foundation supporting a lot of that work in really innovative ways. But to me, there's this other piece that's come up. I've seen it in the chat of like, do we have to only accept the existing constraints and focus and priorities of the system? I would say the answer to that is yes and no, right? Like, so it's trying to be realistic about what those are, but also like trying to continue to move the needle on those. And in places, you know, in many areas, whether that's rights work, whether that's work around building a national care ECD system, whether it's about gender-based violence, we have seen successful efforts across multiple different countries to kind of expand the priorities and the focus of a system. So I just want to name that aspiration is absolutely within the realm of possibility here. It's just a bit harder and it's different work and the trajectory looks different. So
let me ask this then. One might, again, I'm going to sort of be deliberately a little obtuse and the devil's advocate here, but one might have listened to the 3 of you and said, hey, if there's not a doer and payer at scale, if the government's not willing to implement this or the private sector can't implement this and consumers aren't going to pay for it, or the government's not going to pay it, we shouldn't scale it. But I'm hearing a little bit from your last answer, Abe, maybe a slightly more nuanced thing, which is in the short run, maybe that's true, but we should be building capacity and systems. And so I'm wondering if we really need to be a little bit more sophisticated and have more of a phased approach, which is that maybe gradually more complicated systems or solutions can be scaled. In the short run, we should start with what the system can deal with. And while we're strengthening the system, and the same thing with end users. I've seen end users when they're presented with 5 or 6 or 7 components of a system, they only adopt the first 2 that make sense for them because they only have the capacity for that. But if they work, they'll try the 3rd one and then the 4th one. But like you said, this is a 7 to 15 year process. So is it really black and white? Should we just, if if there's no doer and payer, we don't scale it, or would one of you like to give a more nuanced answer? Maybe Anita, start with you.
Sure. I think to me, the answer is not necessarily, right? Like, I think that there's some critical challenges that governments may never have enough resources to fully solve, and that markets will never have an incentive to solve. So systems change comes to mind. Social norms change comes to mind, right? Like, because in social norms, for instance, the solutions are really expensive and they take a long time. But once you do it, it's hopefully done, right? And there might be some things related to public goods. So social norms as an example, if we think that social norms change is an essential component to solving broader development challenges, then we will need philanthropy for that. And we will need to do that work without imagining that government or private sector is going to pick it up. But I think that for us saying that to be credible, we have to be a lot more disciplined, right? Like, we shouldn't assume maybe that every good intervention can achieve durable scale through governments or markets. But we also shouldn't assume that none of them can and keep relying on philanthropy for everything, right? Because if we can move more solutions or components of solutions into the hands of governments and markets, then we're reserving our effort, like philanthropic efforts, for the challenges that really need it. And that's already a more effective use of philanthropy. That's my 2 cents.
Avery, you want to come in on this? Should we not scale things that don't have doers and payers, or is it a little bit more complicated than that?
I'd get you on your language, Richard. What do you mean by scale? Should we fund things that go beyond doer and payer that are scalable? I'd say, yeah, absolutely. But I think we should be really clear. We're not funding scaling efforts. We're funding systems change work and system strengthening. And I think what's really important as a funder is to know your lane. Malago is really clear. We'll look at 100 organizations that are all doing an effect size that's consequential and have something that's like, is for every dollar you put in, dollar out. But only one of those is going to have the durability piece figured out. So for us, in our language, we're only going to pick that one that's going to scale. But we think that other funders and other buckets of money absolutely need to and should be funding a lot of the underlying infrastructure around governance system strengthening. But we would not call that scale.
Yeah, well, that's fair. But I coming back to Anita's intervention, I think it's interesting. She was talking about social norms, but if we could, use a very broad sense, social norm is a public good. Okay. One of the things I've seen quite commonly, especially for private sector pathways, is the need to create a large enough market to encourage investment and market entry. And you often see the first investor actually not make it ultimately, but they've been successful because the subsequent entrants are having better, cheaper products. So the problem's being solved, even though that particular innovator and their particular model didn't go to scale. How important, especially because Malago, you kind of invest in these social entrepreneurs, do you see separating the particular entrepreneur and their model from creating a space where the problem can be solved as sort of a public good?
It's an excellent question. It's super nuanced and something not a lot of people ask us. So 50% of our fellows are for-profit, and we believe they do have a pathway to what we call like market building. But we anchor on the big idea being what we want to go big, not necessarily the entrepreneur. So this is nuanced. Let's say, for example, one of my fellows right now is Dennis from Soko Fresh in Kenya, and he's doing cold storage as a service. Certainly not the only guy there, but we're betting that is a big idea. And that if we can be a first mover, we're willing to take first loss, we'll give him free cash as a for-profit for several years. And even if his business were to fail, we would see success as that idea going bigger. And some examples of that are early stage, like Malago's been doing this for 20 years. So look at and it's other examples of like Ingeniri with pellet stoves in the carbon market with stoves. Don't need to go down a wormhole if we think that's a good idea or not. But we thought we were successful in that investment, not because Ingeniri ends up being a big company, but because it pulls in a lot of other actors and players that end up being profitable. So we think that there's a lot of roles that philanthropy could and should play in early stage market building, and it shouldn't be anchoring on the investment of that company as much as the opportunity of that idea.
All right, we've got 2 minutes left. Abe, I want to turn the mic over to you. You can either pick up on some of the things we've been talking about, or you can have a last word on whatever you like.
I mean, maybe I'll just conclude by kind of coming back to the beginning, which is to say, I think it's really exciting for me to see the sector writ large. I was at school this year, and the conversation is just completely different than it was 10 years ago. I think more and more funders and doers are embracing this idea of durable change for impact at scale and embracing all three components of that equation. And I think that's hugely exciting. It's encouraging for the sector. I would actually call that systems change. To me, that's co-impacts. So I think there's a language thing that gets in our way oftentimes, but to me, the core essence is like, how do we solve these problems at the scale at which they're at in a way that will endure? And it's a really hard problem, but it's the right problem, I would say, in many of these contexts. So I'm so excited, and I'm eager to kind of partner and learn with everyone else who's working on this effort. Thank you all for the time today.
Thank you. Well, one of the things when I'm doing scaling coaching of various interventions or teams, I say, if you ask the wrong question, you get the wrong answer. So I think you're pointing out that we need to be asking the right question. Anita, last words from you?
No, I think I've said plenty. And just that
Okay.
I share, I'm really glad that CARE's willing to do the work, to work in this different way.
All right. Well, thanks to the three of you. I think this I knew this was going to be one of the best webinars we've ever had, and I think we have met that very high bar. Thank the three of you. We will be posting the this video and audio and probably a transcript on our website. That usually gets up by the end of the week. Well, today's Thursday, but certainly within a week. Maybe we can have them back because they're so great. But thank you again, Avery, Anita, and Abe, and to the fact that you not only are great people, but represent institutions that are really embodying this new approach. I think I agree with you, Abe. It is very exciting. We've been waiting a long time for this. And maybe, Buddhists say that the lotus flower grows in the mud. So there's maybe the crisis in development, there's a reason for that. So thank you all three. Thank those of us who participated virtually on the chat, and hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you.